Okay, so I have the dreaded after lunch spot, so you can all, pull out your pillows and blankets and have a little nap. The good thing for all of you is this is a theory piece, so there are not going to be any numbers, there are not going to be any tables, you don't have to sort of focus too hard. The bad thing for you is this is a very early stage project. Poor Asaf was getting sort of, completely revised drafts up till the 11th hour. Am I not? That's the mic? Okay. So, a little bit challenged in terms of presenting this, but what you have is really our initial thoughts. So be kind. But be constructive as well, because the advantage of early stage work is there's lots of opportunity to improve it. All right, so this is a paper that takes on a little bit what Cliff said in his opening remarks, right? The standard, particularly the finance or economics side of the corporate governance literature focuses a lot on sort of the allocation or the struggle between insider power and shareholder power, and typically paints this struggle in confrontational terms. So in this paper, which is joint work with Simona Sepe, we offer a different theory. We argue that really we should understand the insider-shareholder relationship as collaborative, and that's true both as a descriptive matter, at least sort of in an evolutionary sense, and that's desirable from a normative perspective. And we also talk about some implications that follow with respect to regulation to legal analysis. So this doesn't work, so let's try this. Yes, that works. So the paper starts with, the two sort of standard models or theories of the corporation. One focused on management power and the other focused on shareholder power, but perhaps to sort of crystallize it a little bit more, shareholder power to the extent that and we don't take a position on whether shareholder power is good or bad in this sort of standard model. Shareholder power is typically described as a limitation or a constraint on, at least in the U.S., managerial self-dealing. And obviously, if we expand this around globally, we have to think about self-dealing more broadly. We're starting from the U.S. perspective. So the idea being that we have agency costs and we can empower shareholders to try to reduce those agency costs. And Lucian, of course, has written a great deal on that role for shareholder power. The reason we say that these are sort of confrontational theories, there's all of this literature portraying this as a battle between shareholders and managers, a battle for control, takeover battles, control contests, white knights, wars, wolf packs, and all of this colorful language. And that was my best possible picture of a battle. I could have little labels for, insiders and shareholders, but you get the basic idea. So we say that's not really true, and instead we should see insiders and shareholders as engaged in a collaboration. All right? Descriptively, we say collaboration is actually more consistent with the existing structure of corporate law. So Cliff's remarks this morning were talking about a variety of decisions in which we have insider and shareholder joint control, joint voting power on something like a merger and additional equity issuance. We see joint power in a variety of different aspects of existing law. Collaboration is also consistent with private ordering to the extent that we have variation in charter and bylaw provisions, variation in terms of the level of shareholder voting rights. These are all modifications of the way power is shared, but they're all about sharing power. Right? Our paper is designed to offer a normative justification for this collaboration. Why is the model a collaborative model? we argue that this is a way of increasing firm value. And we don't argue this from a historical perspective. This is very much a present-day paper, state-of-the-world paper, in part based on the fact that we believe the agency cost story, to the extent it's a problem, is not the key factor driving economic value today. Could be that existing levels of shareholder empowerment have successfully reduced agency costs. It could be that there are other economic forces disciplining managerial self-dealing, but we don't think the key driver in economic value, in stock returns and so forth, is agency costs. And in fact, we believe that in the current economic environment, the main problem is one of information. Right? So our story is about collaboration as helping firms address information, and in particular, the problem of partial information. And several implications follow from that. Okay, so this is just this sort of descriptive part of the paper. Why do we describe firm structure or firm theory in collaborative terms? Because we see lots of different examples of collaboration. We see this, as Cliff talked about, with respect to allocations of decision-making authority. We see this in engagement between insiders and institutional investors, both engagement by what might have been called as traditionally passive investors, mutual funds, and engagement by activist investors. And the paper walks through a variety of anecdotal examples, and I would welcome more. We're still filling in this part of the paper. We're still talking to people, both about mutual fund engagement, things like the shareholder director exchange, in which institutional investors don't just meet with issuer representatives, but try to set up some sort of guidelines, some sort of principles for ongoing engagement. How responsive should corporations be? What should be the guidelines for this kind of dialogue and so forth? And we see this in instances of activism. Activist investors like ValueAct at Microsoft taking a long-term approach, taking an approach based on not some sort of investment banking type change, but a deep operational understanding of the business, bringing that operational understanding to affect business decisions, and implementing that strategy over a period of, in this case, almost 4 years, right? So that's not your typical activist investor, come in, sell a piece of the company, get out with some sort of quick buck. And as I said in the paper, we have a number of examples of that. So why do we think this makes sense from a normative perspective? We start off with the recognition that in today's world, we have more information than ever, and that firms increasingly suffer from a partial information problem. Firm insiders, and we know that there are a variety of reasons for this, firm insiders may have a limited information set, may not fully understand or be able to predict the consequences of their operational decisions. But we also see the case that institutional investors today are particularly able to supplement that information, to bring new complementary information to operational decisions, because activist investors and passive mutual funds both have different understandings than insiders about the way the world works. Now, if I were to simplify the types of information, I might say that they specialize kind of in two different areas. Mutual funds, particularly passive mutual funds, indexed investors, and public pension funds have in some cases, devoted some expertise to specializing in governance issues, understanding the way corporate governance works, understanding the role of governance in disciplining management, in making management more responsive to market changes, market conditions, and so forth. And in many cases, what institutional investors bring to a specific company is that background, that understanding, applied to the firm's specific context, right? This is our experience with staggered boards, right? This is how we know that staggered boards affect things. This is why it applies in this particular way for you, for this specific company. Activist investors are different. Activist investors may have industry expertise, may have a deep knowledge of suppliers, customers, international expansion, and bring those sorts of talents and those sorts of information to the insiders. And what's interesting, of course, about either type of information is to the extent that it's supplied to a company by investors, it's supplied essentially at no cost for the insiders. So there are some people that talk about, well, a firm could always buy this information, a firm could always hire, say, a consultant to bring in the same sort of expertise. But institutional investors may be lower cost providers, and for reasons that I'll talk about and that we detail more in the paper, there are also reasons to believe that institutional investors have economic incentives to bring high quality information to the firm because they benefit from that information. And what we're talking here isn't just research, isn't just gathering information, but also interpretive value, understanding how this information is relevant to the specific portfolio company, in part because of the institution's economic investment in that firm. Right? So we argue that collaboration is the most efficient form of information sharing between and among insiders and shareholders. Right? Now the paper goes on and uses some game theory, and I'm not going to go into the details of the game theory here, but the paper goes on to talk about a couple of different points. First of all, we make the claim in the paper that collaboration, deliberation, joint decision-making is a more efficient way of conveying information than trading through the market. Right? In a market environment, investors, shareholders, can use their private information to capture arbitrage opportunities, to capture trading gains. But the maximum trading gains that are available are discounted by the fact that the shareholders don't have the insiders' information, don't have the private information about what the firm is going to do. So if they're, and the example we offer in the paper talks about, well, okay, if you've got a company that is manufacturing a computer, manufacturing some sort of hardware, it's valuable for that firm to know the market environment into which they're sending that hardware. Is the hardware going to be compatible with software developments and software demands out in the world? A hardware company might not have that kind of expertise. A hedge fund might have expertise more broadly in the technology space, might understand very well what the current software developments are. If the hedge fund trades on that expertise without knowing, without being able to predict with any certainty the company's operational decision with respect to the hardware, right, it's going to be willing to trade only sort of at a middle point. Right? We're estimating maybe there's going to be compatibility, maybe there won't be, but the trading has to be somewhere in the middle. If, however, they can affect the operational decision, they can coordinate their software knowledge with the firm's operational investment in hardware, they can reap the maximum value for the firm because the firm makes the efficient production decision. Right? So that's the basic idea. That was very quick. Very quick summary of. So we go on and use game theory to talk about, well, okay, if we were going to take the view that collaboration is in fact efficient, if you've bought into this so far, even though I've given you only a very quick summary, does this give us some guidance in terms of how to structure the collaboration? Couple of ideas here. First of all, we think it's very important when you're thinking about structuring collaboration to think about not Asaf warned me, are you making some sort of claim about how much power shareholders should have here? And I think we're really not. But what we are arguing is that the way you align incentives appropriately is to think about shareholder power from two perspectives. One, to what extent should shareholders get to benefit from this collaboration? How do we reward shareholders for participating in this deliberation, in this joint enterprise? And here, our at least initial point, and we've been going back and forth on this, is that shareholders' reward should be, as is traditional in shareholding, based on their economic interest, based on their ownership rights. It's not necessary, it's not appropriate to give shareholders some sort of additional economic reward for collaboration. And the reason for that is that we think the investment decision is the strongest evidence of shareholders' ability or potential ability to contribute to operational efficiency. In other words, the shareholder who understands, I've got this information that can improve firm decision-making, has an incentive to invest, because the larger their investment, the more they're going to benefit from that information. And it also conveys credibility. Put your money where your mouth is. You've got a big stake. This essentially tells management, look, this investor has done their homework. This is not some off-the-wall idea, right? They've got some reason behind their investment. So the point about assignment of economic rights should be based on, should be proportional to shareholdings, but of course that's a prescription that doesn't require any sort of regulatory change, doesn't require any shift in the existing balance. The more difficult question is allocating decision-making rights, right? So there's the question, what sort of power should shareholders have? And here, and this is what's going to lead to our sort of legal implications, here what we think is that the thumb on the scales should be for mechanisms that facilitate joint decision-making. So let me go back again to Cliff's initial remarks, right? When Cliff talked about different mechanisms for shareholder power, keep in mind that none of the mechanisms that he was talking about were unilateral shareholder power. Shareholders were not initiating the issuance of additional shares. Shareholders were not initiating a merger or some sort of structural change. Shareholder voting rights were simply a way of giving shareholders some say, right? Arguably a veto right, but some say to balance off or to work together with the existing rights that management has. And what we would argue is that the way we think of these shareholder rights should be based in part on the subject matter, because that's a way of capturing the potential contribution that shareholders can make by exercising some sort of voice. All right, so we have as I said, several implications from this, but before I get to the implications, and in order to sort of lay out the foundation for the legal takeaways, we have to keep in mind the fact that this is not all a sort of sugar and cream story, right? Joint decision-making has a potential downside. What's the potential downside? Well, to the extent that you have managers, insiders involved in the decision, and you give them some veto power or some sort of role, there's a risk of management entrenchment. On the other hand, with respect to shareholders, if you give shareholders some sort of power, there's a risk of short-termism, or potentially there's a risk of self-dealing conflicts of interest. One of the points that I had about Jürg's paper was the possibility that what we might see when public pension funds are involved in political contributions is they might be acting out of selfish interests or interests that are not shared by other shareholders, such as facilitating local jobs, protecting local employees, and the like. That's, could be a kind of self-dealing in the institutional investor context. Now, I know we're going to have a very good paper tomorrow suggesting that shareholder short-termism isn't really a problem, and that in some cases it's actually great for shareholders to be short-term. So let me be clear. I'm not taking a position that either of these problems exist or on the degree to which it exists, but obviously to the extent that these are our decision makers, those are the problems that we have to be sensitive to. And it's these risks that form the basis for our regulatory reform proposals. So, okay, 3 proposals. One, preference for charter-based governance rather than bylaw-based governance. And this builds upon some developments in U.S. corporate law, the sort of contract model of the corporation. Second, balancing board and shareholder power, ensuring that this is a collaboration, not a single decision maker, and limiting the power for both entrenchment and short-termism, particularly in the takeover context. And 3, reframing the scope of directors' confidentiality obligations. Let me talk about each of these very briefly. How am I doing on time?
7, 8 minutes.
7, 8 minutes. I'll finish early, so we'll have extra time for Asaf and the questions. Okay. So first, charter versus bylaws. Here we build a little bit on some of Lucian's earlier work. We're not saying that you can never have governance bylaws, but our claim here is that at least when we're talking about rules of the game decisions, when we're talking about structural provisions in the corporate governing documents, these provisions should be placed in the charter rather than in the bylaws. And the reason is that if they're in the charter, they're the product of joint rather than unilateral decision making, right? If you're worried about managerial entrenchment and management can adopt bylaws that limit shareholder power, that's going to frustrate the ability of shareholders to collaborate. That's essentially going to give management some sort of veto power. Now you might say, well, that's all well and good, but we know that these days, everything that happens in the charter happens at the IPO stage, and there's no way that the IPO charter is in fact the product of joint decision making. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. The founders of the company get to put whatever they want in the charter because governance provisions in the charter aren't priced. Everything in the initial IPO is based on the company's earnings history, and so stockholders take whatever it is they get. So that is absolutely a concern. It's also a concern that depending on the structure of the corporation and the applicable voting rules, some corporate charters are very hard to change even after the IPO stage. So we're working with and talking about a couple of possible solutions to this. One possibility might be sunsetting certain governance provisions in the charters. In other words, you have something in there, but it only lasts for a certain period of time. This is something that a number of companies have done with respect to dual-class stock. But you could have a provision like a staggered board in the charter that only lasted a certain number of years, or other similar provisions, supermajority provisions, same kind of thing. Another possibility, and again, this is early stage, we're just thinking about this, is maybe you change the rules not to allow shareholders to amend the bylaws unilaterally, but to give shareholders some sort of initiation right, the ability to put something before the board of directors instead of having to wait passively until the board of directors proposes a charter amendment. Now you might say that's no big deal. The board of directors doesn't have to act, even if the shareholders formally can initiate a charter amendment. But today with shareholder advisory firms, with the power of institutional voting, we think the mere fact that something is on the corporate agenda, gets powerful shareholder support, is going to exert an awful lot of pressure on directors to respond. So it's kind of the sort of broadening of the Harvard Shareholder Rights Project to issues other than just staggered boards. So that's the first of our proposals. Second proposal, replacing, again, unilateral provisions with collaborative, with joint decision-making in a variety of different areas. So we talk about a preference for staggered boards as a joint decision-making mechanism rather than poison pills, or shareholder input on poison pills, shareholder authorization for a board to implement a pill, shareholder ability to limit the scope of a pill, the temporal scope. We talk about say-on-pay, and you might argue that say-on-pay is a great example of joint decision-making, right? Because you've got shareholder input, and it's not the vote itself that we argue is joint decision-making. It's the dialogue. It's the discussion between shareholders and companies in the vast majority of cases before they ever put the issue up for a shareholder vote. These are our concerns. This is why a particular pay structure isn't providing executives with the right incentives. This is why a particular pay instrument is subject to abuse, right? It's that dialogue that we see as the core of shareholder collaboration. Now, this joint control, of course, introduces concerns of its own. And in particular, one of the things that we worry about is to the extent you give shareholders a role in any of these areas that they don't already have, there's a risk that shareholders will use that role inappropriately. They'll use it as leverage. They'll use it to exert other benefits. And people have talked about that a lot, both with respect to, say, on pay and with respect to shareholder voting more generally, that shareholders can use this as leverage to force other changes, again, to force changes that might relate to self-dealing and the like. And some of the empirical studies of, say, on pay, including work that we're doing, is exploring some of those questions, exploring the extent to which those concerns are valid. Finally, confidentiality. So one of the ongoing debates is the extent to which directors' confidentiality obligations limit their ability to share information. And it comes up in particular with respect to blockholder directors, such as the directors that are nominated and elected pursuant to activist hedge fund nominations. And Rob, of course, has done an empirical study that you're going to present, right, tomorrow. Information sharing can create concerns. Some of those concerns might be, okay, if there's leakage of that information into the market, that can damage the firm, right? Bill Ackman leaks information about JCPenney publicly, and arguably that was damaging to JCPenney. Leaking information can lead to insider trading, either by the hedge fund itself, or the hedge fund gets together with the hedge fund portfolio managers get together with their portfolio manager buddies. We all know how this works. And so if the hedge fund has material non-public information about the firm, it's quite likely that that information is going to find itself in the hands of other hedge fund managers who will then trade on the information, and Rob shows that that occurs. And of course, there's the risk that either the hedge fund or other people will also use this information in ways that are damaging, such as to compete with the firm. The problem is that the typical response is to limit the ability of directors to share that information with their firm, right? The response is, okay, directors have to keep things in the boardroom. And our observation is, well, if you do that, you undermine the value of having activist directors on the board. The whole point is the activists bring information, they can bring firm-specific information back to their firm, and they can take advantage of hedge fund information that allows them to interpret, to understand, to use that information more effectively for the portfolio company's benefit. Right? So one possible response, and again we're exploring this, is can we think about fiduciary obligations a little bit more broadly? Right? This is not saying, okay, if you've got a blockholder director, now all of a sudden the hedge fund is a fiduciary. But maybe it's a fiduciary with respect to its access to and control of that firm's specific information. So I'm out of time. Conclusion is, let's rethink this in collaborative terms. Let's rethink this in collaborative terms because we really think corporate governance should capture more effectively the information, the contribution that today's institutional investors can make, and let's explore mechanisms that will make that collaborative process more effective. Thank you.
I have to disagree with Jill on 2 points before I start the discussion of the paper. The first point is I think that for the economists in the crowd, the fact that there are no formulas here is actually more difficult for an after-lunch paper than a legal paper. And the second point is that I actually really like the fact that this is an early stage paper. Usually when you get to comment on a paper that has been workshopped around, it's very difficult to find comments here. Since this is a very first draft, there are many ideas in the paper. There are many thoughts that one could bring to the table. So this paper is an attempt to offer some new conceptual framework for us to understand the new landscape in corporate governance. There's the old theory that focused on agency cost. Now we have a new reality that calls for a new theory about collaboration. The old theory was about allocation of power between managers and shareholders, or more specifically about the fight over who should get the power. The new theory, and this is my attempt to summarize the paper. Paper has a very complex line of argument. It starts with a positive account about the fact that we live in a more friendly environment than in the past. Then it makes the claim that collaboration actually enhances firm value because of complementary information sharing. Then it uses cooperative game theory to explain how should one structure cooperation between the parties. Then it talks about implications for corporate law. And I think one of the major comments that I have going forward is, should all these theories be in one single paper, because each one of them is novel in its own account and requires a lot of effort to explain and to convince the reader. But eventually it all boils down to the power, the allocation of power between shareholders and insiders should be tied to their informational input. And I have comments or questions about the positive accounts and some comments and questions about the normative account. Is it really that we don't have conflict anymore? Is it really about the value of information? And then, should we really try and tie the value of collaboration to the allocation of power between insiders and shareholders? So let's start with the claim that, now it's less confrontational. Well, first, those proxy fights that do exist, if you read the press releases, they're not the friendliest type of statements. Moreover, I grew up in a neighborhood where we engaged in many fights. And one of the things that you learn, or maybe I learned because I was thinking about that, although I did fight a lot, is that you never fight with someone when you know what the outcome is going to be, right? Because then you're stupid, right? You fight.
Unless you're winning.
No, but then, you fight when there's some uncertainty over the outcome. And maybe what we see here, it's not that, the power, the allocation of power doesn't really matter, is that, at least today, because of the reconcentration of power with institutional shareholders, it's pretty clear in many of these cases that shareholders will get their way. And maybe we should also be focusing more, and I'll get to that later on, about the implications of the paper for CEO versus boards. And again, I'll get back to that later on. One point about the value of information sharing, I found it interesting that one of the claims in the paper is that, as Jill said, it's not a claim about history, but now it's more about information and new economy firms. How do you reconcile that with the fact that some of the new economy firms like Facebook, Google, and others are the ones where founders insist on having dual-class stock? Does it mean that they don't care about information and information gathering and so on and so forth? This is just a small point to think about when presenting this argument. Another point, and Jill addressed it in her comments, but should be further developed in the paper, is the difference between hedge funds and mutual funds when it comes to information that each one of them has or could have with different regulatory limitations. The thing that I found to be most intriguing and raises question here is the implications that the paper tries to draw from the notion that we have some form of collaboration that may be value enhancing for how we should structure decision-making rights. So they talk in the paper about one guiding principle for how you decide how should you allocate decision-making rights. Decision-making rights should be allocated according to the marginal contribution of each party's informational inputs, and that's why part of the claims here are because investors have more informational value these days. Maybe they should get more input. They also make the point that in practice, in most cases, normally it's the board that has a lot to add in terms of informational value, unless the company is underperforming. And given these starting points, they try to offer a new way to allocate decision-making power between shareholders and the board. And I'm going to focus on the rules of the game decision. For Julian, I know that there are other people here. For you, it's one of the differences between the UK system and the US system. In the UK, shareholders can unilaterally change the charter. Under Delaware law, you need to have both boards and shareholders in order to make a decision. So they make a suggestion that most rules of the game decisions should be in the charter. That means typically both board input and shareholder input, with some arrangements to take account of the fact that the IPO market is imperfect. Now, this is one question that I had, and you answered it in your paper. If let's assume that we all agree on the collaborative model. We know that the board could sometimes be the best from a position, the best, and the board or insiders are the one with the best information about the company. Sometimes it's shareholders. Why do we need to change the rules of the game, right? Presumably, shareholders would make an ad hoc decision whether they go with the board or whether we go with some activist shareholders or someone else. And in fact, in the paper and in the presentation here, the argument for having some form of board veto is that you have some speculative investor interventions. That's how it's defined in the paper. And in the presentation, Jill presented it as short-term investors. In other words, we start with a model that says, we don't care about agency costs anymore. It's all about collaboration. And then we end with a model that says, look, there are two types of agency costs. We need to, when we make when we make decisions about how do we allocate power, we get back to this agency cost and we add speculative investor interventions. And again, if you don't buy, if you're not convinced by the speculative investor interventions argument, then you end up with just shareholder power as Lucian likes it to be. And the second point, and that's a more legal point, if you really believe in the IPO amendments that say, well, it's going to be some sunsetting, or it's going to be some form of limited shareholder power to unravel arrangements that were decided at the IPO stage, then again, it all boils down to shareholder power, and we end up with shareholders being the ones making the decision, which again questions the importance of insisting on a board veto, even within your own framework. So what do I think? Some things to think about. I read the paper. I found the collaborative model to be quite interesting. I think it actually describes what's happening in many of the companies where you have activist directors being appointed to the board. I'm not sure, or at least I think the paper could be written in a way to make it more convincing that it necessarily says something about boards versus shareholders, or board versus shareholder power. Maybe it says something about how we should think about the role of the board of directors in intermediating knowledge, the links between CEOs and knowledgeable investors. And maybe it should be more about the second part of your applications, about mechanisms to facilitate collaboration given the allocation of power. And again, the legal treatment of activist settlements, constituency directors, and other legal questions that arise where today it's very difficult to explain. Some of what we see without having a good theory of, look, there's value in this communication between shareholders, boards, and the CEOs. Thank you very much.
So
Jill, you are not really suggesting a board-centered model of shareholder power, right?
Right.
Along the lines of Bainbridge or Stout. You're actually probably closer to Lucian than you are to them, if I had to guess.
That's probably.
One of the key questions for you to decide what you think about is, should shareholders be able to amend the charter unilaterally? Should they be able to say, you know what, we decided on this rule, we want to change it? What would be the downside of that? Because that's the rule in much of the world, right? And if there are disasters from that rule, I'm not aware of them, right? But that's an area where the U.S. differs from many other countries. We don't let the shareholders propose charter amendments. It has to start from the board, which makes it much harder for the shareholders to change charter. That's just a question.
Another comment I may add, no comment, I will add a comment. I think the main problem is collaboration between the board and management. The board also brings information to the management, and all the dynamics between the board and management may influence the company very much. If you take an anti-position, like you are a corporate governance guy, and everything they bring, you think they are going to make you something wrong, okay? They have something in the back of their mind, okay? So that would paralyze the board. I think this is a very delicate balance, and the main problem first, before shareholders management, is board management relations, is the trust, is the collaboration, is the sharing information. A lot of times they don't share information. They don't want to share information with the board because the board is going to be against them, or going to leak it out, or going to kind of undermine their position. So I would start with the board management collaboration, and then see if, as a second layer, shareholder collaboration can act. Okay.
Yeah, quick question. I'm not sure about the term collaborative. I mean, I think ever since we put a prohibition on slavery, everything in the market is voluntary, right?
Right.
And so if you look at agency, particularly the original Jensen Meckling, I mean, it was a voluntary exchange. You would hire somebody, but you would recognize that their objectives were somewhat different than yours. And so I guess the first thing is, do you recognize or do you acknowledge that managers in some dimensions may have different objectives than shareholders? Does that, to the extent that you think there is that difference, you probably want to give more power to shareholders. If you don't think there's much of a conflict, then you give less. Then there's the information. If you think that the shareholders have information that's valuable, you probably want to have them more involved in the decision making. And in fact, Mike and Bill have worked on that, on who has the specific knowledge. And the last thing, if you want to put something else into the mix, is that I guess Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales have a paper where that they're saying that shareholders can have a different objective function. It's not maximizing the stock price, it's whatever else they're doing. If you believe that that's great, you'd probably want to involve shareholders more in the decision-making process.
If you think that that objective function should be the firm's objective function. I mean, that in part, there's a question of whether you characterize that as shareholder self-dealing or a legitimate way of defining the firm's objectives.
Whatever, but I mean, to the extent that, so again, I'm not sure about the word collaborative, because I think a market arrangement has to be collaborative once you got a law of slavery, which we have. So, and it seems to me that the level of shareholder involvement, how much you want them involved, is whether you think things like agency is a big problem or a small one. You know, I think Lucian has a view, and I'm pretty close to it, other people are far from that. And the information differences, and maybe the objective differences. So, I don't know if you've worked that into your paper.
I've seen somebody very inventive. Okay. Lucian.
Happy to hear that Jill, you're closer to the view that Steve or I have than the other side. Let's see whether maybe the comment can give you the epsilon farther in the direction. One is, I think that the shareholder power view is not, I think, one that is in any way in tension with collaboration and friendliness and so forth. It just means that to have the best collaboration, it's good to have as a background one in which the shareholders have the power. So for example, when Lloyd Blankfein works with the head of a division, he would say, we collaborate, we go on trips, we work 18 hours a day together, we collaborate, we think together. But in that relationship, Lloyd Blankfein keeps the power and doesn't give the number 4 Goldman Sachs veto powers of any kind. So the question is more whether the collaboration would be best functioning against the background in which there is joint power or power for the so-called principle. And the second comment is there's also, I'm not sure, as much a tension between having, both sides have information. You have the intuition, which is interesting, that if both sides have information, then both sides should have some of the power.
I'm sorry.
Then both sides should have some of the decision-making power.
Right.
Now, if this is right, it's much bigger than the corporate context, because you can say it about the basic principal-agent problem. So in the standard formulation of the principal-agent problem, it's fundamental to it that the agent has some information that the principal doesn't have. But in all the standard works, and in most of the contexts where we have principal agents, it leads to all kinds of complicated problems and contracts and so forth, but it usually doesn't involve giving the agent veto rights and joint decision-making power over the decision. So the question is, what is special in the corporate context versus
Okay, let's do some, okay, Marco.
Yeah, so let me try and ask the question I was maybe thinking Cliff would ask, but it was nice. So you presented a model of delegation of power of shareholders to the board, more or less delegation. And you talk about collaboration. Now that's quite different because I understand the delegation, because if you delegate a lot, the shareholders don't take those decisions, and if they delegate less, they retain decision rights. But that doesn't require any collaboration.
Correct.
And they don't collaborate on class 1 votes, they just retain the right to decide. But they have to give you the right information in order to decide. So what's different between your view of the board and what
So what's different about our view is that there's actually a deliberative process. The shareholders are not simply electing representatives and delegating certain decisions to them, but they're playing a role in the formulation of those decisions. So that's why the specific examples of the information sharing in a shareholder director exchange or the information sharing in the context of an activist campaign, right? There's an actual, they're bringing the discussion to the table and then jointly, as a result of that, agreeing on the operational decisions that the firm's going to make.
So it would be that management proposes something and then shareholders have a veto, right?
No,
No.
we're discussing it.
They just discuss it, they can't veto it.
It's not,
What happens if they disagree?
They have to compromise.
If everybody agreed all the time, there would be no problems, right?
no, but the point is that at least in the standard model of the US firm, there isn't any way for the shareholders to bring that information, that operational information, into the boardroom, into the discussion. So if you think about the successful activist that gets hedge fund board representation, right? They've got a minority stake on the board. The fact that they've won the election contest, if you put it in, contest terms, doesn't mean that they now control board decision-making. But having a seat at the table allows them to bring their information and integrate that information with the board's discussions in a way that they hope is going to change the firm's, future operating policies. right? That's what's distinctive about it. So it isn't that the shareholders are getting some sort of veto power, or that in the absence of that, the board's going to decide on its own. It's actually joint decision making.
So they get the private number of the CEO and they can call him or her up.
What if they disagree? It's still not out here.
Yeah.
So in some sense, that information transfer process does happen through media. You know, that people write news articles, they can write things that they want from us, and then board members read.
Well, that's absolutely possible, but of course, it's going to be a much less efficient mechanism, among other things, to the extent that you've got shareholders who have invested in developing specialized information, have a business plan that's actually private information, right? The publishing is not going to be the same kind of thing, they're not going to make the investment.